Chapter 8 of The Silk Stocking Murders by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A visitor to Scotland Yard. Pleadle was in a waiting room when Roger and the chief inspector arrived in Scotland Yard. There had been some discussion between the two on the way as to whether Roger should appear at this first interview or not, and it had been decided that, as Pleadle would probably be still a little torn between reticence and the reverse, the presence of a third person might tend to tip the balance in favor of the former. In order that Roger should not, however, miss any of the conversation, he was to lurk behind a screen in a corner of the room. Moresby had given instructions over the telephone that no hint should be given to Pleadle that the police were already taking an interest in his fiancée's death, so that whatever he had come to say should be completely spontaneous. It was therefore with eager anticipation that Roger retired into his corner, where he was pleased to find that, by applying an eye to a carefully cut aperture in the screen, he could watch the proceedings as well as hear them. A few moments later, Pleadle was shown in. Roger wondered at first whether their precautions had been unnecessary, for Pleadle seemed perfectly composed. "Good evening," he said in a reply to Moresby's greeting. "I know nothing about the procedure here, but I wish to see somebody on a highly delicate matter." "That's right, sir," Moresby assured him. "You can say whatever you wish to me." Pleadle looked a little doubtful. "I was thinking that perhaps the assistant commissioner—" "Sir Paul is out of town this evening, sir," Moresby replied untruthfully. "At the moment I'm in charge. You can say anything you wish to me. Take a chair, won't you?" Pleadle hesitated a moment, as if still not quite contented with a mere chief inspector, then seemed to accept the inevitable. As he turned to take the chair, Roger was not quite so sure of his composure. There were little lines at the corners of his mouth and eyes that might indicate mental strain. His self-control, however, was strong. Now that Roger could observe him more nearly than in court, he saw that the Jewish blood in him was not just a strain, but filled his veins. Pleadle was evidently a pure Jew, tall, handsome, and dignified as the Jews of unmixed race often are. Roger liked the look of him at once. "Now, sir," Moresby resumed when they were both seated, "what did you want to see us about?" He spoke in easy conversational tones, as if his visitor might have come, for all he knew, to sell him a drawing-room suite on the installment plan. "My name is Pleadle," said the other. "I don't suppose that conveys anything to you, but I was, he corrected himself painfully, engaged to be married to Lady Ursula Graham." The chief inspector's face took on a correct look of condolence. "Oh, yes. A shocking business, that, sir. I needn't say how I sympathize with you." "Thank you." Pleadle fidgeted for a moment in his chair, and then his composure and his self-control alike disappeared. "Look here," he blurted out abruptly, "this is what I've come round for. I'm not satisfied about it." "Not satisfied, sir?" The chief inspector's voice was a model of polite surprise. "Why, how do you mean?" "I'm not satisfied about my fiancée's death. I'm sure that Lady Ursula would have been the last person in the world to kill herself like that, without any reason. It's grotesque. I want you to look into it." The chief inspector drummed on the table with his knuckles. "Look into it, sir?" he repeated. In cases such as this, Chief Inspector Moresby carried on most of his share of the conversation by echoing, in an interrogatory form, the last 2 or 3 words of his companion's last speech. It was a good method, for it saved him from sitting dumbly, and it also saved him from contributing anything of his own to the conversation. Moreover, it is an excellent way of drawing out one's interlocutor. "Yes." Now that his outburst was over and Pleadle had got his chief trouble off his chest, his calm was returning. "I'm convinced there's something behind all this, Inspector. My fiancée must have had some good reason for doing what she did. She must have been threatened or blackmailed or something horrible. I want the police to find out what that reason was." "I see, sir." Moresby continued to drum absently on his table. "But that's really hardly a matter for us, is it?" he suggested. "How do you mean?" Plato retorted, his voice indignant. "I tell you, Lady Ursula must have been hounded into taking her life. She was driven into suicide. She must have been. And isn't that tantamount to murder? Supposing it was blackmail, for instance. That's a matter for you, isn't it?" "Oh, quite, sir, if you put it like that. What I mean is, this is all too vague. It's only what you think, after all, isn't it? Now, if you could give us some evidence to support what you're saying, well, that might be a different matter." Roger smiled. He appreciated the chief inspector's method. By pretending to make light of his visitor's suspicions, he was hoping to goad him into revelations concerning his fiancée which otherwise he might be most reluctant to make. It seemed, however, as if Moresby's subtlety was not to be rewarded. "Evidence?" said Plato more calmly. "That's difficult. I don't think I've got any evidence to give you. Lady Ursula never gave me the slightest hint that anything was amiss. In fact, the whole dreadful business is a complete mystery to me. All I know is that she wouldn't have done a thing like that without reason, and we don't know of any reason. Therefore, that reason ought to be found. Surely it's up to you to unearth the evidence, not me." Roger reflected that, up to the present, Plato's suspicions almost exactly corresponded with his own concerning Janet Manners. Indeed, had not that chance bombshell flung vaguely in Moresby's direction blown away the cobwebs from his own brain in its bursting, they would probably be the suspicions that he still held. And what would Plato say when he found that it was not a case of hidden reasons for suicide at all, but of simple murder? Roger studied him carefully through the little aperture. Under that normally composed, almost cold exterior, no doubt the fires of passion could burn as fiercely as anywhere else. More fiercely, perhaps, for it is those who habitually keep a tight hand on their emotions whose outburst, when it does occur, is far more violent than that of the normal individual. And after all, in this case, the blood was Oriental in origin, however remote that origin might be. With the lust for vengeance which must sweep over him as he learnt the truth, Plato might prove a useful help in the investigation. Roger decided that he ought to be told that truth at once. The chief inspector was ambling gently round the question at issue. "But do you think the Countess would like Scotland Yard called in, sir?" he was asking. "Now that everything's settled, wouldn't it be better to leave it like that and not rake up what may turn out to be a nasty scandal?" Plato flushed. "I'm not necessarily calling you in," he replied. "One only does that when there's something definite to call you in for, I suppose. I've merely come here, after considerable reflection, to report to you my personal opinion that there is something behind the scenes here which ought to be brought into the light. You may, of course, hint at a nasty scandal in connection with my fiancée. I prefer to look on her as the probable victim of a blackguardly conspiracy which has ended by driving her to take her own life. And in my opinion, you people here ought to investigate the matter. That's all I've got to say." He rose to his feet, picked up his hat and gloves, and walked towards the door. "Good evening," he added curtly. Moresby rose too. "1 minute, sir. If you're not in a hurry, I wonder if you'd mind waiting a short time before you go. There may be something in what you say, and perhaps we ought to look into it. I'd like to mention it quickly to a colleague, and he might care to see you. In cases like this, you see, sir, we have to be very careful not to—" His voice droned away down the passage outside. In a moment or two he was back. "Well, Mr. Sheringham, what do you make of all that?" "He's thinking exactly as I did at first about Unity Ransom. Knows there's something very wrong, but can't just see what it is. We ought to tell him." The chief inspector looked dubious. "Tell him it's murder?" "Yes, he might be very useful. He's our chief lever for uncovering Lady Ursula's case, I should say." But I don't think we'll tell him straight out what we think, Mr. Sheringham, if you don't mind. It's a thing we never do unless there's a very definite object to be gained, and there isn't here. But I've no objection to letting him know that we're already investigating the case." "Very well, and ask him if he can throw any light on that note of Lady Ursula's." "Of course. Well, I'll fetch him back." Returning, the chief inspector introduced Roger to Plato as Mr. Sheringham, who is going to look into this case with me. Plato seized on the point immediately. "Ah," he said, "so you are going to look into it?" The chief inspector contrived to smile an apologetic smile in which there was no apology. "I'm afraid I wasn't quite open with you just now, sir. You mustn't mind. We're very fond of our secrets here." He winked maliciously at Roger. "To tell you the truth, we're investigating this case already, in a quiet way. Have been for the last 2 days, in fact." "Ah!" Plato stroked his chin thoughtfully. "So my coming wasn't such a surprise to you, after all." "We wondered if you might," Moresby agreed. "Mr. Sheringham was only saying a short time ago that he'd an idea that the same things that had struck us might probably have struck you." Plato turned sharply to Roger, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "They did, Mr. Sheringham, very forcibly indeed, and I've been spending the last half-hour trying to induce the chief inspector to look into the case officially, without, as I thought, the least success." "Well, well," said the culprit paternally, "let's sit down and talk it over. Mr. Sheringham will tell you that official secrecy is rather a vice of mine, but now that the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, no doubt you can help us considerably." As a metaphor applied to the circumstances of Lady Ursula's death, Roger could not help thinking this was an unfortunate one. Roger and the chief inspector sat down on one side of the table, and Plato, removing his overcoat, took a chair opposite them. He was in evening kit, in which his tall, well-made form showed to advantage, unlike those of most of the financiers Roger had met. Moresby began by putting his questions, which the other answered as readily as he could, and Roger took the opportunity, while the familiar ground was being covered once more without anything fresh appearing to emerge from it, to study their visitor anew. The term financier conjures up a slightly repulsive picture. It is unfortunate that financiers, in the abstract, should constitute an idea that is repulsive, but so it is. No doubt they will bear it. The ideal financier is short, stubby, with squat fingers, small eyes, no hair, and a protruding stomach. Plato had none of these marks of the tribe. Considered as a specimen of humanity, he was pleasant to look on, with sharp, clear features, dark brown eyes that were perhaps the slightest bit hard, but only if one looked at them very searchingly, and plenty of black, crisp hair. Considered as a financier, he was an Apollo. His age was somewhere between 28 and 35. It might have been either. Of course, Roger had heard of him before the tragedy, as he had heard of Lady Ursula Graham. Plato Sr. was of the financial rank that is known as the power behind the throne, meaning, in these days, the power behind the party. Plato Jr. had been spoken of for some years as more than a worthy successor, with several exploits of sheer genius on the financial battlefield already to his credit. Father and son were outstanding for another reason also. They were scrupulously honest. They were behind no shady deals, and they never crushed unless they were unnecessarily attacked. Noting the lines of young Plato's jaw, the glint in his dark eyes, and the tiny lines about the corners of his mouth, Roger summed up his impressions in a sentence. Quote, "When that man does learn that she was murdered, he's not going to rest for a minute till he's seen the judge put on the black cap." End quote. A not unpleasing little thrill ran through him. Though he was the other's junior by perhaps half a dozen years, he found himself looking at him just as, in his early teens, he had looked at his house football captain. It was not often that Roger suffered from an inferiority complex, but he came perilously near it at that moment. Moresby, having hitherto been able to elicit nothing of very much help, was questioning Plato about the note Lady Ursula had left, warily because he did not yet wish him to grasp their suspicions of murder. Roger understood that the chief inspector considered that more might be brought to light in these early stages if Plato remained in ignorance of that. Murder, especially where one's own fiancée is concerned, is apt to upset one's sense of proportion. "No," Plato said, "I agree that the wording is curious, but I can't tell you anything else about it. It's in her handwriting, of course. Otherwise, I might have been tempted to suggest that it had nothing to do with the case at all." "You're sure of that, naturally?" Moresby asked. "That it's in her handwriting, I mean? Quite sure?" "Of course," Plato replied, surprised. "What else? Oh, you mean it might not have been left by her at all?" "Something like that. Look at it this way. The wording's so curious that we might almost say that it was written on some other occasion altogether and got there by mistake, mightn't one? Well, can you give us any help on those lines? Ever seen it before, for instance, or heard of it?" Plato looked puzzled. "No, I can't say I have. But how should I? I mean, supposing it had been left there for Miss McLean at some other time." "But it wasn't. I've ascertained that. You're quite sure you can't help us with that note, then?" "Quite, except that I agree with you that the wording is so remarkable that it might well refer to some different occasion altogether." The chief inspector studied the ceiling with some care. "You and Lady Ursula were in Monte Carlo last February, weren't you?" he asked, apparently of a small fly. "Yes, we were," said Plato, surprised again. Roger pricked up his ears. Moresby had not mentioned this fact to him, and he did not at first see its significance. The next moment he understood. "Do you happen to remember what date you got there?" the chief inspector asked casually. Roger listened intently. The French croquette, he remembered, had died on the 9th of February. Plato was consulting a small engagement book. "I got there on the 14th of February, but Lady Ursula went there earlier, at least a fortnight before me." He flicked the pages. "Yes, she left London on the 27th of January." "I wonder if it would be giving you too much trouble, Mr. Plato," remarked the chief inspector, "to make out a list sometime for me of all Lady Ursula's men friends or even acquaintances who were already in Monte Carlo or the neighborhood when you arrived." "I will, yes," Plato said, looking considerably mystified, "if you really want it. But what can that have—" "I do want it," beamed the chief inspector, and that was that. Plato accepted his rebuff in good part, though it was plain that he had not an idea why he had been rebuffed at all, which is the most irritating kind of rebuff there is. "When I arrived," he said, "not the ones that came after myself. Lady Ursula, by the way, stayed on after I did. I left on the 3rd of March, and she was there for another fortnight or so." "Well, take the second week in February, Mr. Plato," said Moresby, with apparent carelessness. "The ones that were there when you arrived, or any you heard of who left during the preceding week. As full as you can make it. That will do well enough." A few minutes later it was intimated that Plato might leave, and that the police could now be considered to have the matter in hand. Should anything further occur to him, he could always reach the chief inspector on the telephone. "Well, we didn't get as much as I hoped," Roger said, rather ruefully, when they were alone together. "Except that about Monte Carlo," Moresby pointed out. "That's a bit of luck, you know, Mr. Sheringham. He hadn't been engaged long then, and he'd be bound to have noticed all Lady Ursula's friends of his own sex. Couldn't have better conditions for the observation we want. We might just as well have been there ourselves. Mark my words, his memory won't slip a single man that Lady Ursula spoke to that fortnight." "Oh, and talking of lists, there's something I forgot to tell you," said Roger, not without excitement, and went on to explain the one of Janet's Dorsetshire friends which he had obtained from Anne. "Ah," said Moresby significantly. "In other words," Roger pointed out unnecessarily, "if by any luck one name figures on both lists, we've got our man." "We know who he is," corrected the chief inspector, and left the rest unsaid. End of Chapter 8.